Can you tell me about the Naylor Review and how that's threatening the NHS right now?
The Naylor Review is little known, produced by Government Commission recently. Last year, 2016, I believe it was produced. The report basically says that large quantities of NHS property must be basically sold off to provide 10 billion of new funding to counter the claim that the NHS must be more efficient, has insufficient resources, and if it's to balance its books, must find its money from elsewhere. And so the process is simply to sell off NHS resources. Anybody who manages to sell it off gets a sort of throw in an extra freebie to give the incentive to sell. This is completely disruptive. This is the national asset that underpins the NHS being privatised, so we'll be paying rents, we'll be continually in hock to bankers, to PFI companies or whatever else. We've seen the disaster of that in some parts of the country. You know, just look at Bart's NHS Trust and see that it's virtually bankrupt. One of the best hospitals, the oldest hospital in the UK, is virtually bankrupt by privatising its assets. This is what the Naylor report is going to do to the rest of the NHS.
What they're trying to do now, isn't it? It's a land grab.
It is basically, as you say, a land grab. I call it a rent grab. We live in a world where capitalism seems to have ceased to innovate, where they don't have any great new ideas about new products that we need. You know, if I grab my phone out of my pocket, frankly, the next iteration of the phone, whoever produces it, will not do something very much different from the last one. There are no great technical innovations. The innovations that exist require very little capital. There's a large amount of money floating around the world owned by a few very wealthy people that wants to earn a rate of return, and the only way they can find a rate of return, it seems, is by actually capturing public assets funded by the taxpayer for private gain.
So this is a way for them to stash their money away to grow with no effort whatsoever at public expense.
No effort, no risk, completely contrary to the spirit of which capitalism was supposed to be built. It's not free market enterprise. Well, let's go back a long time in UK history. Once upon a time we had something called enclosure. That's when ordinary people were thrown off the common land so that the aristocracy could literally build a wall around that land for their large private estates. And then they charged rent on the new property to which they had thrown the people. That's exactly what's happening here. We're seeing an enclosure of our assets for the benefit of a small number of very wealthy people who will enrich themselves at cost to everybody else, with us suffering with reduced services as a result. That's one of the consequences of neoliberalism. It's threatening the NHS.
From what you said earlier that you like to pay your taxes, can you explain why? Because most people might see that as, well, some right-wing commentators might see that as a bit odd.
I don't see it as odd to want to pay my taxes. I mean, I'm not pretending that everything that I want in life is provided by the state. Quite clearly it isn't. But I'm going to give you a metaphor here. It's a cappuccino. The cup is the state. If there was no state, you wouldn't end up with the product. The espresso coffee in the bottom is the government and what it does. On that foundation, you add the hot, frothy milk, which is the private sector. And then you sprinkle on the top of it some really exciting bits which end up in Sunday Times colour supplements, which are the things which excite us and make us believe that it's the private sector that do all the exciting bits in life. Now, the reality is that when you drink a cappuccino, you drink the espresso and the hot, frothy milk and the hot chocolate all out of the cup provided by the state. It only works as a whole. I am very happy to pay my taxes because I know if I don't pay my taxes for some incredibly valuable things which are most efficiently provided by the state, then I also can't have a successful private sector, which, by the way, I'm quite happy to have. I'm a chartered accountant. I've been a director of private companies. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the private sector, don't get me wrong, but it has to work in a controlled, regulated environment, doing what it does best, which is certainly not owning assets in the NHS. And then, when the two work in harmony, we get a prosperous economy. But right now, because we won't pay our taxes, or we're told we don't want to pay our taxes, and we cut taxation, and we try to cut the size of the state, we don't just harm the state, we shrink the capacity of the private sector to provide for our benefit as well. It's ludicrous. You actually have to pay enough tax to build the prosperous foundations for a private sector economy, which in combination with that state can deliver the services that we all need to enjoy to have a good life.
in terms of why the message about the overall neoliberal philosophy, why isn't that message getting out there amongst the public?
We're not telling this story about the danger of neoliberalism well enough. You know, this afternoon I gave a talk. It was 4 minutes. It took 4 hours to write it. People say it was good. It sounded like it was off the cuff. Yeah, it was off the cuff because I spent 4 hours writing it. But we have to work really hard to make these new messages about the danger of this system clear, transparent, understandable.
And there's more commentators, even industrialists in America, who are realizing that the runaway cost of their system is affecting their bottom line. They're having to pay more and more money to private insurance companies to cover their workforce. So, you know, even noises from the States are saying that their system is broken, yet we're racing headlong to replicate the American system. What is the most important thing that people can do to get the word out about the NHS?
Well, people have to say they like the NHS. Now, we say that, but we actually have to say, I want an NHS that is accountable. An NHS, therefore, which is actually one that I understand the minister is in charge. I understand that there are people who I can see who are controlling it. Not a company, not an unknown, offshore-owned enterprise owning my GP surgery, owning my hospital, but actually a health authority that I can see who's on it, where representation is controlled by my local authority, by political appointment from central government, where I can hold somebody to account, where I can say, what are you doing with public money? Now that's what they've got to call for, a publicly controlled NHS, and I'm afraid we haven't got that. So they need to say, I'm willing to pay for it, but it's also got to be accountable to me. And it's got to work to integrate healthcare for the physical person, the mental health care that we all will occasions sometimes wonder whether we need. I'm sure we all will at some point. And also social care. So I want an integrated, beginning, cradle to grave, whole of person, regional health care that is accountable to the people where we live.